All right, welcome everybody. I'm Rabbi Micah Streifer, and I'm thrilled to be with all of you and really excited to welcome Dr. Stephanie Gray to teach us today. Our topic is Hospicing the Earth, Jewish Rituals for Dying Worlds. I'm really interested, just totally intrigued by this topic, so I'm excited to learn from Dr. Gray. Let me introduce them, and then I will turn things over to them to lead us through this discussion. Meanwhile, as I said a moment ago, please feel free to be introducing yourself in the chat so we all have a sense of who we all are. Dr. Stephanie Gray is a grassroots organizer, ritualist, and scholar based on Quapaw, Osage, and Caddo land in central Arkansas. They teach internationally to build collective knowledge to politicize, transform, and inspire communities into collective action. Dr. Gray is the spiritual leader of Taste of Olam Haba, a pluralistic Jewish community. They have a forthcoming chapter in Religion, Politics, and the New Materialism, Philosophical Perspectives, published by Palgrave. They are a research fellow with the Global Center for Advanced Studies. So please, everybody, join me in the blessing for study. If you feel comfortable, now is a good time to unmute yourself so that we can hear each other's voices as we sanctify this act of study, this act of engaging together in Torah. Let's join together. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed is the Eternal, whose mitzvot, whose commandments bring holiness to our lives, and who commands us to immerse, to engage ourselves in words of Torah. Dr. Stephanie Gray, take it away.
Thank you. Amen. Hi, everybody. It is so nice to see a variety of faces. Love hearing where everybody is calling in from on the chat. I'm sure we'll have folks join us sort of as we dive in, but I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and make sure everybody can see it. Oh, can folks see this? Great. Okay, let me make sure I can see people. All right, I can see everybody. All right. Thank you so much, Micah, for the introduction. Excited to be here. You may have noticed in the introduction, Micah included the ancestral land that I am on here in Little Rock, Arkansas. I do encourage folks, if you do not know what ancestral land you are on, to look that up to kind of see and maybe add that to the chat if you already know. I do want to add here a land acknowledgement that I usually give whenever I do trainings, and also I think to be able as Jews to do land acknowledgements, also that is a key part of Torah. So included this piece here of Torah from Leviticus, for the land is mine, you are but strangers resident with me. And so I would love if somebody wants to come off mute and read this for me. Any volunteers? I'm going to ask you to talk in this, so I'm going to hope that folks are eager to talk with me. Go ahead. Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead.
Which one? Okay. We acknowledge the land itself as a living sacred entity, one to which we are already bound and to which we are accountable. We name that our presence here is made possible, though, through histories and ongoing realities of settler colonialism, including genocide, displacement, enslavement, ecological destruction, and systematic undermining of indigenous governance, knowledge, and life. These violences are not past. They continue to shape who has access to safety, land, water, health, and future. We recognize that the so-called privilege of living, working, and gathering on this land has been made possible by the denial of those same possibilities to the indigenous peoples and to the land itself. We are called not to guilt or shame, but to honestly motivation and action. Honesty. The last part?
Yes, please.
We commit to actions that move toward repair, return, and shared survival. We offer this acknowledgement as a beginning, not a conclusion.
Thank you. Can you tell me your name?
Jan Pales.
Jan, thank you. I appreciate it. So, kind of this last piece here, we commit to actions that move towards repair, return, and shared survival. It's kind of the key of what today's kind of conversation is about. And really acknowledging this is a beginning, not a conclusion, right? Kind of what I'm going to be sharing today is all kind of just ways to be thinking and reimagining and thinking about and dreaming together. None of what I'm really going to be providing you is like, this is the answer to solving the climate crisis, right? There is no one answer to how we sort of face the future that we are looking towards. But again, hopefully, many of us have different relationships to the land in which we're on, understanding climate change, the climate crisis. So I recognize folks may be in different places. So hopefully, if there are any questions, I'm going to kind of go through some kind of broad strokes and go more into the specifics of like the actual ideas for hospice. But if there are questions that I'm kind of going over or there are different pieces, I encourage you, write them in the chat. I also love to be interrupted. Feel free to just like come off mute, ask a question, just so we can also all sort of feel like we're kind of on the relative same page, even though I don't know that we could ever all be on the same page, but moving forward together. So let me see here. Let's go to the next slide. So whenever I do any class, trainings, workshops, I always like to include some community guidelines. These are both for me as a facilitator, what I want to be able to like commit myself to by showing up in a learning space where I am also like learning with all of you. And what I'm going to ask that all of you try to be able to commit to in this next hour that we have together. So I'm going to read some of these that we commit to holding multiple incommensurable layers of complexity and resist binary thinking. This is a really big one as we're talking about the climate crisis. We have to be able to think and imagine and really sit with complexity, and some of that can be uncomfortable. But hopefully we can kind of create a container here to be able to sit through some of those questions. And we orient ourselves away from mass death towards respect for the sacredness of all life, the human and more than human. You will kind of see throughout my presentation, I don't really talk solely about humans, right? As we build kind of an ecological ethic, how do we understand humans not as center? So hopefully kind of we can orient ourselves towards that, and really naming and challenging systems that render some lives less valuable, less grievable than others. I am an explicitly an anti-oppressive educator. So part of my work is understanding systems of power and how do we combat systems of power and be able to build out different ways of power. So want to make sure that we aren't uplifting some of these systems that, again, are rendering lives more valuable. We practice politicized compassion, and we recognize that the earth, all of its labor, vulnerabilities, all of its limits, are the things that bind us together and make us interdependent. And recognizing that that interdependence and that entanglement, it contains such beauty, the fact that we are able to be on the Zoom room and learning together, and such joy that can be brought from the fact that we live on this planet also brings pain and loss and grief and death. Really, the focus of today's training is holding a container for that. I do want to provide a bit of a content warning. We are going to be talking about death. That can sometimes bring up really difficult and complex feelings as we understand our own relationship to death, the fact that we have experienced death in multiple different ways, whether that's with the human or non-human. So we are all bringing that into the space. And I'm going to ask that folks embrace vulnerability as a necessary political tool. I think as a culture, we are often told to not be vulnerable. There's a weakness in vulnerability. So I'm going to ask that people share. We're going to have some breakout rooms where we're going to have some conversations as well as talk through some different ideas. So want to make sure that we are respecting each other and, trusting and giving care. And we want to hold stories that people share with responsibility. I always use this phrase, what's learned here leaves here, what's shared here stays here, which basically means if you learn some really great content from this webinar, I want you to share it with folks. But if someone's sharing a personal story, I'm going to ask that this kind of stay in the container of this space because that makes it more welcoming for people to feel like that they can be vulnerable and share if folks are not taking their personal stories outside of this space. Can I get like a thumbs up? Kind of, if you're on Zoom in the chat, we're all sort of good with these. Great. And if there's anything that's not here that you want to add of like what you feel like is really essential to creating a learning space, I totally also invite you to add that to the chat as well. Seeing some folks here adding in their ancestral lands. Beautiful to see. I will say, Micah, if there's also a question in the chat and I'm like, I don't get to it within a reasonable amount of time, please just like read it aloud and I can make sure to answer it. We're going to go to the next slide here. So this is a positionality slide. I'm kind of giving you background about me, how I do my work, how I sort of approach this work as a scholar and as an organizer. And so this specifically is coming from Indigenous, queer, CRIP, kind of disability justice lenses and decolonial analyses and practices. So a lot of the kind of ancestral tradition I come from informs the work that I do and the way that I approach my work. I do a lot of field research, kind of all around different parts of the world, specifically looking at the impacts of the climate crisis, how we're already seeing climate collapse happening, and specifically working in communities that are most directly impacted by the effects of the climate crisis. Kind of three clusters of illusions that I see in doing my work, and kind of that will sort of frame the rest of our conversation is the illusion that we are separate or that we are superior from either the land, from each other, from other non-human beings. And with that comes a denial that we are not entangled with each other in this kind of web of ecosystems. There's an illusion that's related to kind of the human-centeredness, right? That we as humans are innocent, or the fact that, there's a patronizing nature, or that there is a way in which all of these were inevitable to be able to support the, growth of human civilization, which often is the denial of systemic violence and harm, right? Part of, as we talk about hospice and some of these terms, is right, recognizing complicity and responsibility. And so also a key part of this is removing it, as I said earlier, kind of the human as the center. And this last sort of kind of key part in the way that I think about my work is the illusion related to linear progress and the possibility of continuity with the denial of the limits of the planet, right? Um, a key kind of part of this is we are not going to have human civilization last as long as we think that it will. That there are limits of the planetary and the limits of what the planet can sustain, and that is a reality. Part of this kind of framework of hospice is recognizing that and not denying that reality. There's also some really beautiful pieces in terms of Judaism of working around or rejecting a kind of linear view of history and progress. I will say a lot of my other work has been more around some of these questions of time. We won't dive into this one as much as the other two, but I do think that is kind of a key piece of kind of being able to reimagine how we think about time. Really a great time to, as I always recommend, Heschel's The Sabbath. I think it's like the 70th anniversary this year of the book. Always a great kind of book to engage with when we think about Jewish concepts of time. Okay, so here is sort of the basics here of what are we facing? Like, why are we having this conversation? Which is understanding the impact of what we're facing with the climate crisis, which is 90% of the world is experiencing irreversible increases in temperature. There is over 70% of the world is experiencing irreversible categories of rainfall. We are seeing far more extreme patterns of weather. There are many ways in which we have reached the limit that now climate change is irreversible, and it is far bigger than most of us realize. We are far past the point of no return in many aspects of the climate crisis. As we see here, mass extinction, extreme weather, forced migration, ecological breakdown is already changing, and we have already seen the loss of ecosystems, species that are not returning, glaciers that will not be able to reform, coastlines, entire ecosystems and way of life that have already been permanently altered. I am here in the South. A lot of my work and research has been here in the South, especially um, in relationship to a lot of the Gulf states. I know, Micah, you were saying you're from New Orleans. A lot of the work that I've been seeing is around in New Orleans, in South Florida, already seeing the mass extinction of multiple different species. So we're kind of coming to this conversation with a recognition that climate change exists and it is far worse, and the impacts are already impacting the world in far greater scale than I think most of us are aware of. And so creates a sort of condition for us to have to be able to radically reimagine how are we thinking about being able to attend to the realities of these like permanently altered states of living and being together. So I think most of us, hopefully, on the call sort of recognize that the climate crisis is an issue that affects every other form of social justice, right? I want to recognize, right, like as we're having this call, we are still sort of facing, and for many of us, grappling with the questions of what's been happening in Minnesota, what's happening in different parts of the state, what's happening on a global scale, right? And I think one of the things that I always tell people is, well, that's also a climate issue, right? Right? The ways in which we think about racial justice, immigration, queer and trans liberation, when we're thinking about disability justice, all of this is impacted by the reality of the climate crisis. So when we think about how people are able to access land, who has housing, who has food, who is able to move to different places to be able to escape the effects of climate change, right? Who is criminalized for surviving ecological breakdown and collapse. When we think of, right, the response right now of ICE, of Homeland Security, the ways in which we are creating immigration policies, those are a direct result of the reality of what we are facing with the climate crisis, right? Do we have enough food in the United States right now to be able to care for all of these potential folks that would be migrating into the United States? So it's a kind of isolationist measure because of the fear that is then accelerated by the climate crisis. Obviously, we know that environmental harm is unevenly distributed. We know that it most directly impacts communities of color, those communities that have historically already been marginalized, have less access to clean air, clean water, um, and often whose grief is met with urgency, right? We can also think of the situation in Flint, Michigan, and the access to clean water there for years and years. This community, because that it did not have the amount of money and resources that other communities surrounding it had, was not met with any sense of urgency to be able to ensure that those folks had clean access to water. And we also recognize that climate disasters reveal the oppressed systems that we're built upon, right? And so when we think also in terms of accessibility, inaccessibility, right? The ways in which buildings are built, the way in which we're building green structures, the way in which we're building cities and infrastructure often exclude folks with disabilities, often exclude rural folks, often exclude so many different people who are again going to be most directly impacted by the climate crisis. Right here in Arkansas, we have experienced increase of tornadoes that have had devastating effects in many cities across the state. These are only going to keep getting worse, and oftentimes these are impacting parts of the city that have the least amount of resources will not be rebuilt as quickly as other parts of the city. So we can see all of the ways in which the climate crisis is only going to exacerbate the existing inequities that already are, happening within our societies and within our cultures. And it's also a spiritual issue, right? Like, why are we talking about this Jewishly? Because as Jews, we are impacted by the climate crisis, and as human beings, we are connected to the climate crisis. and our families are and our communities are. And it's, I think, a hard truth to recognize that Jews have participated, both willingly and unwillingly, in systems of extraction, of domination, and disposability that treats the land as, again, disposable. This is both as folks, many of us, come from immigrant backgrounds, come from, right, questions around exile. And there's like very difficult ways in which we understand what does home mean and how do we understand being able to be forced out of different places. And I think sometimes it's hard to like that is a key part of the Jewish story. And also a key part of the Jewish story is like any other group of people participating in the extraction of lands, participating in the ways in which we also degrade the planet and show lack of respect for the planet, and also, and honestly, you're disconnected from the earth. And so when we think about the climate crisis as a consequence of a world that is organized around separation instead of relationship, and really this idea of how do we control the land instead of care for the land, instead of being in relationship to the land, right? Not just as Jews are we facing a spiritual crisis, any people of faith are also experiencing this as well. And so we need, there's some great folks over at Dayenu, Jewish climate movement that are doing amazing spiritual adaptation tools to be able to kind of help us process and gain tools, spiritual tools. But for us, really thinking in this kind of conversation, what are the tools for grief and death of both the ecosystems that we belong to and human beings that are impacted by the climate crisis? What are tools for teshuvah, or like how are we actually repairing our relationship to the land? Tools for humility, for restraint, and shared responsibility. How, in the process of shuva, in that repair, are we committed to changing our behavior, right? As Maimonides sort of gives us these five parameters for committing shuva, right? One of them is not repeating the same behavior. So we need new ways of understanding how to act differently. And again, tools that restore relationship to the land. I think a really important piece is our Jewish tradition already has a lot of this information that we can pull from, right? These are not, in some ways, new concepts to Judaism. I think it's just how have we been disconnected from some of our ancestral roots of being in relationship with the land. Let's see. So kind of the hook of this workshop that people always have so many questions about is why are you using the term hospice? That sounds really negative, or it sounds really dark and depressing. I would say probably doing any of this work is not the most lighthearted work. And for me, I pull a lot from some of the amazing scholars that I know. Whitney Bowman is one of them, who is a queer eco-theologian, specifically works in Florida, and kind of uses this framework, environmental hospice, that also comes from Joanna Macy, who is also kind of an eco-social Buddhist scholar. Um, Really defining this as when societies accept that the systems they have built cannot be sustained and that not everything can be saved. Hospice, in this sense, both refuses denial and a false hope. And so when we think about allowing the planet to die on its own terms is a really radical way of understanding and decentering sort of the human impulse of saying, well, I can fix it, right? Like we can just fix the climate crisis if we recycle, if we do this, if we pass this Green New Deal, if we do these, like we will fix it, recognizing also it was a human created crisis. And recognizing, right, that in many ways, as we said earlier, there are already irreversible impacts of climate change that we are not going to be able to fix. And so, how are we able to live in the messiness of allowing the planet to die and allowing not just the planet, but humans, those that are impacted directly from the climate crisis, without rushing to fix it, right? How do we sit with the memorializing of the planet, of species, of ecosystems? How are we able to really attend to the reality of death? And as a culture, we're certainly going to have some opportunity to sort of think through some of the ways in which we think about death. But this kind of quote here, the dominant stories of modern civilization are a story of mastery, endless growth, human exceptionalism. And all of these stories mask the reality that we have committed as a society to this kind of suicidal burnout of these capitalist systems that cannot sustain themselves. The climate cannot sustain the exponential growth it is seen, right? We call this, right, the Anthropocene, the idea of like we are this new ecological epoch of history of seeing the direct effects of the human impacting the environment. This quote here from Donna Haraway, this is from a great book of called Making Kin in the Cthulhu Scene, which is very interesting premise. Highly recommend it to folks. But this idea of making kin, right? How are we able to hospice the planet? We fundamentally have to be able to understand kinship, both with the human, non-human, with the planet. So making kin is expanding ways of living and dying well with each other in the thick present, which I really love that phrase, the thick present. I'm giving you a lot of information. Now I want you to talk to each other. Because this session really forces us to think about how do we think about death? Like, what are our own relationships to death? How can we help steward planet and peoples towards a, dignified death if we don't also think about our own relationships to death? So I'm going to have folks go into breakout rooms, let's say for about 8 minutes. And I will actually paste the um, questions here in the chat so folks can discuss them in your groups. But I want folks to be able to think about what are the messages about death and dying that you inherited from your family or your Jewish community? Was death something that you were taught about? Was something that you avoided or moved past? And like you signed up for this class. Interesting question of have you ever thought about death and dying in relation to the climate crisis? Kind of, do you see some of these connections already, or what questions do you have? So I think, Mike, if you just like let me know when the breakouts are good.
I'm
Uh,
ready now. I've made
great.
5 breakout rooms, and they should have roughly 3 people in each room.
Okay, great. And I can stop the share here, just so, oh, I can see everybody. Hi, everybody.
And for those who don't have a camera on, if possible, it's helpful to, if you're able to participate by turning your camera on, then it's going to be better for conversation in the breakout rooms.
Yes. Here, let me paste the questions here so everybody can have them. You should be able to see them once you go into the breakout rooms. Also, you are right on track, Paul. A lot of what I am getting through this presentation is from Vanessa's book, Hospicing Modernity. It's a great framework. So highly recommend that folks read that as well. But here are the questions and enjoy your breakout rooms. Excited to debrief when you get back. See everybody come back. I always hate to stop you from having good conversations. Okay.
Excuse me, Stephanie. Just one thing about Zoom.
Yes.
When we go into breakout rooms, the chat is only those people in the breakout rooms, so we don't see
Um,
anything from the original chat.
Interesting. Good tip for next time. Hopefully you were able to still talk about some of the kind of
Yes, we
bigger
were, at
picture.
least in
Great.
my group.
Awesome. Amazing. Also
You
I
could
saw some, oh, go ahead.
you can open up the chat the same way you open up the chat in the regular room. Just go to the bottom of your screen.
Hmm. Okay, I,
Always learning Zoom
I
things. I also
stand
think they
corrected.
change them like every month, the Zoom settings. So who knows what a new day will bring with Zoom. I did have a couple ask of where to find what native land you were on. So I'm going to add that to the chat if folks want to look up. You can type in where your address is and look that up. Okay, I want to hear from the groups. What were some of the things you were talking about? Anything that sort of stood out or things that you're grappling with? Like to share? Yeah, go ahead, Heidi.
Yeah, I need anybody's help because my friend was going out for a bike ride here, and I said, "Oh, listen to what I'm listening to," because she's all about that stuff, eco, and I said it's hospicing the earth, and she's like, "Oh." So I was wondering if anybody has any suggestions on the the electric impact of the word hospicing. What is it? The dying earth? How would you put it, Stephanie?
Yeah, so I would say hospicing the earth is caring for the death and the dying of the ecosystem,
Okay.
which also isn't that much happier. Um, but hopefully, as we continue on and have some good Jewish tools of how we as Jews talk about death, I think hopefully that could be helpful. But it's always a question of when I'm trying to describe my research of like, oh, I don't know about that. So that's a lot to work around, right? But other folks, other ideas, things that you were talking about in your group. Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm in Central Arkansas. So something that I was happy about, I'm a farmer, and John brought up that he's also working with like a native plant company or like some local doing some native plant workshops. I'm definitely not getting the details correct on this, but that made me
Native
really
plant gardens.
heck yeah, the native plant gardens. Um, and like more of that, I think is beautiful to make those connections in our community. And it is part of our Jewish roots as well, but getting to learn more about where we are currently and what grows here and making that connection. And I liked what you said when we first started about the planet will likely outlive us. So taking care of it the best way we can for it when we are gone too, and thinking about that. I'll pass. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Sarah. By a show of hands, do you feel comfortable talking about death?
Yeah.
Interesting. This is the most hand raise I've ever got in a workshop. Most people are terrified of talking about death. Would love to dive into more if why folks feel comfortable. Go ahead, Shira. Oh, do you have a question or a comment, Shira? I just see your hand raised.
Definitely stressful because we don't know what the tsunami effect was until we're in Jakarta.
Are you talking to me?
I just see that your hand is raised.
Oh,
Just want
I'm
to make sure.
sorry. I'm sorry. My hand got raised when I raised my hand to, but
Oh.
I do have something to say.
Sure, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Um, I'm comfortable with talking with death. My father died when I was 16. And so you know, I got, I guess, that kind of put me in a, I guess getting used to it young. He was sick for a very long time before that. So having grown up with a non-normal childhood, and then on top of that, I was an occupational therapist, which gave me training that talking about all kinds of things.
Yeah.
With people, especially since I worked in as a psychiatric occupational therapist for 18 years. They talk to people about a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing, Cheryl. Yeah, I think all of us also have different relationships to talking about death because we've also experienced death differently, right? Some of us may have lost parents, people close to us. Some of us may have, you know, been themselves closer in proximity to death. I think that it's interesting by generations, by cultures, by different ways in which different folks are around death more often is, I think, a question for all of us to sort of be thinking about. I want to, Aviva, get to you, and then I think we can move on to some specific ideas.
And I'm
when my husband and I divorced, I did a post-degree course at the local college in thanatology, which is the study of death and dying. So it interests me when the course was called Hospicing the Earth, because I think of hospice as people that are hospicing, that are like dying.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that part of what, and I think Paul mentioned the book Hospicing Modernity, right? Like this question of what the challenges of the failures of modernity, and for me, like specifically thinking about the failures of our response to the climate crisis, right, forces us into thinking about tools that we have inherited, either from modernity, from society, as like tools and gateways to help us explore new ideas, and also recognizing the existing language we have is never going to be able to be responsive enough to the future crises that we're facing, right? Like the solution to the climate crisis is not going to be the same systems that built and like created the climate crisis, but part of hopefully kind of, and I'm going to give you some specific examples of things that I'm working on of like the Jewish tradition of like using some of our traditions and rituals to imagine ways of supporting a hospice of peoples, the climate, but also recognizing these are just some interventions that will work in some ways and won't work in others. And again, that there is no, and I really try
Ooh,
to
that something
emphasize
smells
this.
good.
Something does smell good. I hope so. Is the idea of, right, like we use some of the technologies we have, and we also have to be open to creating new words, new language, new tools. Vicky, I'll just have you go, and then we will put the screen share back up.
Don't really think we or believe that we really think enough about the interrelatedness of anything. It's, of our mortalities and our deaths and those of generations past or what may happen in the future in relationship to political climate, our earth, our healthcare, all the pieces that it takes it, it's overwhelming at the same time to think of all that, but to be able to broaden our perspectives both within the Jewish context and broader, I think is vital for us to begin to understand. It's really, I mean, whether it comes to learning new terminology or anything else, it's putting in the work on an individual level and seeing what we can do from there. It's not easy, but I think it's worth it.
Yeah.
So.
I think you're right on track, Vicky. And I think that, as I said before, right, we can't separate the climate crisis from racial justice, right? We can't separate all of, like, we can't separate from, right, anti-Semitism. We can't separate from, like, all the ways in which we are so deeply entangled. And I get a lot of this language around entanglement from a quantum physicist and philosopher, Karen Barad, which not like reading, but do encourage. Um, and thinking of the ways in which, as on a quantum level, we are so inherently entangled with every other part of this planet and the universe, really just like fundamentally changes how we see the world. And hopefully, some like seeing just a glimpse of that in some of the conversations that we're having. We have about 10 minutes left, and so I want to give you just a lot of ideas. And I will have two rituals that I'll share, and hopefully, Micah, like I can send these out to people after the call so you can actually have them and do them. But I want to just like get us starting to think about some of the language that we have in Judaism to be able to like help us like think through what are some of the ways creatively and ritually we can face kind of. I will provide a bibliography. I can do that. I am always happy to share that. Let me see. Let me presenter mode. Can everybody see this?
Hmm.
Not great with the Zoom. Amazing. So here are just some of the rituals that I have started doing in my community and in my research, specifically thinking about end of life care and how we can talk about it through an environmental hospice lens that we're already doing in Judaism. So right before death, we say the confession prayer, right? What would it be able to do to create new liturgy for a confession prayer as we are seeing a species die, right? As we are memorializing and honoring the death of a species. The idea of the group of individuals, the Heber Kadisha, right, that prepare the dead body before the funeral, right? How would we be able to think about similar sort of teams that are able to prepare ecosystems for some kind of memorialization? I've seen this work really beautifully actually from a group in Miami that are my marine biologist. One of them is Jewish, and so this is sort of we came up with some of these thoughts together of really being able to like provide a memorial, and a group of people memorialized the last of the species, and they, you know, cared for the other animals that were in the habitat that were in the Everglades with the now extinct animals, but like really creating these groups of people to really care for the body of the planet, right? If we want to think like very materially, the actual ritualing and cleansing and washing of bodies. Um, Part of this is also like we are not talking about humans, right? Like we are going to be seeing the impact of the climate crisis, which will mean mass death for hundreds, thousands, potentially millions of people, and how, especially in places, I've gotten a lot of amazing research from folks that are specifically within kind of the Pacific Islands, the Caribbean, as well, who are seeing directly, right, rising sea levels, moving people out of their homes, are not even able to like stay on these islands, right? Part of the actual cleansing, there's so much in Judaism about ritual cleansing, not for, you know, oh, to be cleanliness sakes, but a ritual purification. What are the ways in which we can think about some of those tools in response to the climate crisis? One of the things that sometimes when I lead some of these trainings, I always ask of what would it mean to sit Shiva for the planet, right? Of the millions of ecosystems, hundreds of thousands of people that have died in the last several hundred years as a result of the climate crisis, what would it mean to sit Shiva for every single one of those people? Would we ever be able to come out of Shiva? And
Food
for
be
us,
involved?
oh, go ahead, John.
Would food be involved?
Right? Of course, food, we're Jews. Of course, food is going to be involved. We got to feed people. I don't want the revolution if we're not feeding each other. But the idea, right, that like how we actually are able to sit and care and live in the morning is a tool that I think as Jews we have so much ability to recognize here's how we can help people grieve, and here are the built-in guideposts and signals of like how do we actually have to sit with the mourning, which I think as a general kind of Western culture we move away from. So what does it mean for us to be able to sit, to mourn, to feed each other, to bring each other food, to be able to like also have public declarations, right? If we're thinking in terms of mourners Kaddish, right? To, depending on your tradition, to stand with the mourners, right? What if that is all of us, right? What does it mean for us to recognize right now that we are all mourning the planet? And how are we able to draw on whether it is new prayers, whether it is showing up in people's homes in different ways, and it's not just for 7 days, it is like, how are we building that deeper into our culture to have the mechanisms to be able to not avoid the grief, right? I work a lot with with people like dealing with like climate anxiety and climate grief. And for them, it's like, this is the only place I'm able to talk about this. Like, I'm not able to share this. I'm just like worrying everybody, or I'm just like freaking out. Like, what does it mean to be able to like build these containers so it's not just, oh, in these specific circumstances, here's when I am allowed to mourn. Like, we have to be able to build out an infrastructure for us to collectively mourn together. And so some of the things that I've done is actually create ritual language for Yitzhak, right, specifically, I know in much more progressive spaces, I'm sure in kind of the reform movement, other movements of like being able to like create new liturgy, new responses of like understanding like mourning death. So these are also examples. So I want to give a couple of examples of rituals specifically that you could do after this call that I have done with kind of groups. Usually these are more like very large groups and we're in person. But does anybody know kind of the language here of here I have like the tearing? Anybody familiar with that? Anybody want to come off mute and just sort of explain the purpose? Go ahead, Beverly. Oh, you're muted, Beverly.
Yes, well, at the actual funeral, you appear in a garment that is ripped. Oh, it's actually part of the service. Your garment is ripped by somebody, a relative.
Yeah, thank
And
you.
I don't actually know what it symbolizes. I suppose you just intuitively think that it represents the fragility, our fragility, maybe. I don't really know
Yeah.
what does it represent. But I mean, I've done it. I've been present when my clothes have been ripped. Uh,
Yeah, go ahead,
I
Cheryl.
don't. I can't really say if it was helpful. It's just that at the time it was all such a shock, and you're going through this process that is set out for you. You go through the process of burying. Say, in this case, it was my father who died very, very suddenly. It was the shock of it. He died very suddenly, um, and that was just added to it. It just added to the whole experience of being feeling shattered. And you personally felt, well, I did. You felt broken, and that your clothes were ripped was a sort of metaphor for that.
Yeah,
We
thank you,
tear for
Beverly.
the illusion that there. We tear for the illusion. We tear for what is broken and cannot be repaired as it was. We tear for the illusion that there will always be more. Really? We tear because grief that stays, something or another, hardens into despair or denial. That stays in. We tear because grief that stays hardens into despair or denial. Yeah, I suppose that the gesture of ripping clothes made it feel okay to feel the grief, and so.
Yeah, thank you, Beverly. Sure, I'm just gonna keep going because we only have a couple more minutes, so I just want to get through things, but appreciate your comments, Beverly. I think that there is something of also building on Beverly, what you're saying, also visible, right? To visibly see that
Mm.
like you know that someone else is in mourning, I think can also be right, incredibly validating, right? Seeing that someone else is in pain increases hopefully your empathy. And also like there's something material about ripping something. Let's be real. Like I have had many times in the last several months where I just like want to just rip and scream and tear. And like that actually can be a great somatic practice of like actually physically. So whether you can have a piece of paper after this, you can have a piece of fabric, you can have a leaf if you go outside, but the actual act of the ripping and the like tearing itself can also be some sort of like actual like somatic practice that can be meaningful. Another ritual here that I also do is around stones, right? Often in Jewish tradition, we will leave stones on grave sites. There's a lot of a lot of history of why we have traditionally done that. A lot of it is to do with the priest during the temples. Part of it is just like the actual recognition of like this person was here, this is their site, even if it doesn't have a gravestone. So one of the things that I often do with folks is have them take stones, find stones, feel them, connect with them, and then be able to like find a place to create kind of a memorialization. I have a place kind of near the park where I am, where I have like, I will continuously go to bring stones as kind of a ritual, to keep going back to the same place with kids. Sometimes I've had them like write things on the stone of things that they want to remember. That can also be a really nice ritual. I know that we are basically at time. I wish that we had more time. I always want to have like more conversations with folks. But ultimately, when I think about, as Micah said sort of at the beginning, the haru that I lead is called Taste of Olam Haba. We kind of formed in the pandemic of making Jewish baked goods, right? Someone said feeding people, right? We sort of started with feeding people. And I think about this concept of Olam Haba, like this world to come, is not some transcendent place, like the place that we're going after we die. Lots of Jewish theology that could get into those questions. But for me, and like why I'm doing this work, is really about seeing the hospicing of worlds as a way of being able to bring us closer to Olam Haba, this idea of a fully liberated world where we are, and whether or not that includes me as an individual or any of us, right? It's that ability to hold space for conversations, taking responsibility of being able to understand the deep entangledness of our world. Because as Jews, we have already always faced this question of the end of the world, and we've always built tools to be able to respond to the multiple ends of the world. And we're at that sort of place now. And so, what is the ways in which hospice of the planet, of the climate, gives us another tool to be able to stand at the end of the world again and be able to use our tradition to think in new and innovative ways? This is a poem that I can also send to folks afterward. It's pretty beautiful. And this is some supplemental resources that I can also include. And if you want to connect with me, I would love for you to email me. I think, Micah, you can send all of that right afterwards. But really just appreciate the time, the intention that folks brought, and just look forward to hospicing the world together and whatever that means. And so just appreciative of all of you. Thank you so much.